Good morning and welcome from the Marron Institute of Urban Management at New York University. I'm Angela Hawken, the director of the Marron Institute. Our webinar today is co-hosted with the journal Buildings and Cities. We're so pleased that you're joining us. This is the second webinar in the Urban Expansions webinar series. There are 4 webinars in the series. The previous session focused on how urban expansion is measured. If you missed that, you'll find a recording of it online, as well as other recorded webinars hosted by Dr. Solly Angel and his team in our urban expansion program. The NYU events on urban expansion have been widely attended. In fact, over the last 2 webinar series, we're now counting registrants in the thousands. It shows to us that there's a keen interest among academics and practitioners on issues related to how cities grow and to ensuring that they're built in a way that allows all residents to thrive. Today's session is devoted to planning for the future expansion of cities across the world. We need a better understanding of the forces that drive urban expansion and how those forces can be used for good use. We're really grateful that you joined the webinar today, and in so doing, you're joining this kind of growing community of practice on urban expansion. So thank you for sharing your ideas, and very importantly, sharing your experiences from having boots on the ground around these very important issues. A few comments on logistics before we kick off. Please use the Q&A function to ask any questions that you may have. We'll get to as many of those as possible during the session, but all of your questions will be answered and distributed to everybody who registered if a question isn't attended to during the live session. If you have a general comment, please use the chat function. In the chat function, I'll also be posting a link to our newsletter. If you aren't already subscribed to the Marron newsletter, please do register so we can stay in touch to update you of the work of the urban expansion team and to also send you notice of future webinar series. I'll also add to the chat link our Twitter handle for those of you who tweet and would like to stay engaged in the conversation that way. I was also told to make sure I let all of you know that the session today is being recorded. Now, on behalf of NYU Marron, it's my great pleasure to introduce our co-host today, Richard Lorch. Richard is an architect, a researcher, a writer, and the editor-in-chief of the journal Buildings and Cities. Richard, we're so grateful that you're co-hosting again with us today. I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Angela. Let me just share my screen, or try to. There. So I'd like to add my warm welcome to everyone to this webinar. As Angela said, I'm Richard Lorch, the editor-in-chief of Buildings and Cities Journal. This peer-reviewed journal occupies a unique space in academic publishing. It provides a transdisciplinary approach to the built environment and focuses on the interplay between the different scales of the built environment: buildings, blocks, neighborhoods, cities, national building stocks, and infrastructures. Yeah. The decisions about the growth of cities have long-term impacts. They define land use patterns of infrastructure and have enormous implications for human development and resource consumption. This webinar series explores the quantitative and qualitative dimensions of urban expansion: when, where, and how expansion can and should be contained, and when, where, and how it can and should be managed in an orderly, inclusive, and sustainable manner. This series of webinars is a prelude to a Buildings and Cities special issue on this topic. Currently, there's a call for papers. Solly Angel is the guest editor. If you are investigating the phenomena of urban expansion, we invite you to submit an abstract in the first instance. Please don't hesitate to contact Professor Angel or me. The deadline for abstracts is 3 December. Further details about the scope of the special issue and how to submit can be found on our website. We know that sprawl is detrimental to the surrounding countryside, costly in terms of infrastructure, wastes energy and resources, and results in increased greenhouse gas emissions. But the regulatory containment of urban expansion is problematic too, as it can result in land and house inflation, making cities even less affordable. In the Global South, the speed of urban expansion has consistently been underestimated and difficult to plan for, resulting in negative consequences for inhabitants. So I welcome all of you today to the discussions on the forces that drive and shape urban expansion. This transdisciplinary perspective from our speakers will enhance our understanding of how cities change and what options exist to harness and alter these complex and varied forces. I'd now like to hand over to Professor Solly Angel. Solly is Professor of City Planning at the Marron Institute at NYU, and he leads the NYU Urban Expansion Program. Solly currently focuses on documenting urban expansion and densification in a global sample of cities, as well as advising on rapidly growing cities and how to prepare adequate room for their inevitable expansion. Over to you, Solly.
Thank you, Richard, for the kind introduction. Let me start by introducing the theme of this webinar and then move on to introduce our panelists today. The theme of the webinar today is the underlying forces driving urban expansion. There's no question that cities occupy larger areas over time. You just saw that all in the animation that preceded the beginning of the seminar. Paris, France, to take one example, expanded in area more than 200 times between 1800 and 2014. How is this expansion to be explained? Why do cities expand out? Why do cities expand outwards? Why do some cities expand faster than others? How do we explain the variations in the urban extent of cities and the rate of change of this urban extent? Is it city population size, city income per capita, the availability of buildable land on the urban periphery, the availability of transport and water infrastructure, the cost of urban transport? Is it the use and value of rural land on the urban periphery, or the shortage of construction finance or reliable electricity for multi-story buildings? Zoning restrictions on the development on the urban periphery in the name of protecting fertile agricultural areas and mitigating global warming? Is it the limits to the enforcement of these restrictions in rapidly growing cities? The answer to these questions matter because when planning for the expansion of cities the world over in the coming decades, we need better understanding of the forces that are driving urban expansion and how they can be put to good use in shaping the emerging footprints of our cities. In this webinar, we have brought together a distinguished multidisciplinary panel, an urban geographer and regionalist, an urban historian, and an urban planner economist who've written extensively on these issues to debate and discuss them. I would like to put this webinar in a broader context. This is the second of 4 webinars on urban expansion, as Angela said, that take place on Thursday, 4 weeks apart, during the fall of 2021. The first webinar, focusing on defining the extent of cities and how to measure their expansion, took place 4 weeks ago. The third webinar, focusing on efforts, some more successful than others, to contain urban expansion and what we can learn from these efforts, will take place 4 weeks from today. The fourth and final webinar in this series, focusing on the state of the art in preparing cities for their orderly expansion, will take place 8 weeks from today. All the 4 webinars will be recorded and available for viewing on YouTube. In parallel with the webinars, as Richard noted, there's a call for papers for a special issue on urban expansion in buildings and cities with myself as guest editor. Please note that a previous 4 webinar series in the spring of 2021 on the anatomy of density is available for viewing on YouTube as well. The proposed structure of the webinar is as follows. We will proceed now with short 10-minute presentations by the 3 panelists on the theme of the webinar. Following their presentations, we will have a discussion among the panelists initiated by responses to questions posed by me. I will then provide final closing remarks. We aim to finish the webinar at 12:30 Eastern Standard Time. I now have the honor and the pleasure to introduce our panelists. In the interest of limiting the time of my comments, I will have to pass over many of their accomplishments and focus only on very concise biographies. Our first panelist is Marcy Burchfield. She's an urban and regional geographer. Marcy is currently the Vice President of the Economic Blueprint Institute at the Toronto Region Board of Trade. She was formerly the Executive Director of the Toronto-based Neptis Foundation, a nonprofit foundation that conducts and publishes nonpartisan research on the past, present, and future of urban regions. Most relevant to this webinar, Marcy was the lead author, together with Henry Overman, Diego Puga, and Matthew Turner, of the groundbreaking study titled Causes of Sprawl, A Portrait from Space, that was published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics in 2007. Our second panelist is Professor Emeritus Robert Bruegmann. Bob is an urban and architectural historian. He was a distinguished professor of art history, architecture, and urban planning at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Bob is the author of numerous books and articles, and including the award-winning book, The Architects and the City, Holabird and Roche of Chicago, 1880-1918, published in 1997, and the book, The Architecture of Harry Weese, published in 2010. Most recently, Bob was the editor of the book, Art Deco Chicago, published in 2018. Most relevant to this webinar, Bob is the author of the seminal and controversial book titled Sprawl, A Compact History, published in 2005. Our third panelist is Alain Bertaud. Alain is a unique combination of an urban planner and an urban economist. He's currently a senior fellow at our Marron Institute University. Prior to joining NYU in 2012, he worked as an independent consultant for a number of clients, including the World Bank, the Brookings Institution, the Lincoln Institute, the Beijing Transportation Research Center, and Civitas in El Salvador. Alain was the principal urban planner at the World Bank for many years, where he advised a large number of local and national governments on urban development policies. He also worked as a resident urban planner in a number of cities. Most relevant to this webinar, Alain is the author of a book, Order Without Design, How Markets Shape Cities, published in 2019. I will now give the podium to Marcy. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. Appreciate the invitation to share some of the work that I've been involved in over the last 20 years or so around urban expansion. I believe we're going to have my slides shown. There we go. Thanks, Juan. So again, thank you for the invitation to participate in this really fascinating webinar series. I'm gonna start by just giving a bit of an overview of the sort of the publications that I'm going to be speaking about. So these are really lessons that from the publication that Sally mentioned, The Causes of Sprawl, Portrait from Space. If you can hit the next slide around Thank you. And I got the year wrong. It's actually 2007 with Henry Overman, Diego Puga, and Matthew Turner. That was a really interesting multi-year project where we really put together sort of two main national urban data sets or national data sets that really spoke to the growth of urban regions over the period of 1976 to 1992. And then I'm going to move to sort of Canadian cities, because those are all sort of American-based cities, metropolitan areas. I published some work with Zach Taylor in 2010, and then again in 2014. Zach is a political science prof at Western University in London, Ontario, and two publications that we put together are this Growing Cities and Alberta Cities at a Crossroad. Both of those are sort of comparative and historical and comparative sort of studies that look at in one case 3 and in another case 4 fast-growing Canadian cities, and looking at really the challenges between the drivers of growth in each of those contexts, and then the policy development, urban development regime for each of those cities. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then the next publication is Planning for the Next GGH, which GGH is the Greater Golden Horseshoe, an acronym that we give the larger sort of Toronto metropolitan region in Canada, because we don't like to name our biggest city. But that publication is really about the drivers of growth as it relates to employment growth. And some changes that we're seeing, through the economic structural changes that are happening in the economy, and how they're playing out on the ground. And then the last publication that I'm really be speaking to is some work that I'm doing at the Toronto Region Board of Trade, and that's really looking at this sort of business of these areas that have very specific out of them, and then also infrastructure that's needed to support the growth in them. So you can hit the next slide. The first publication is a Sprawl Portrait from Space. And really, as I said, we really measured urban growth between 1976 and 1992, and really described the degree of sort of scatteredness of that new development versus the compactness in terms of how a region grows. And in that publication, we introduced a sprawl index that really measures the amount of available undeveloped land that surrounds the average sort of individual sort of urban dwelling within that area of, both from the 1976 data set and the 1992 data set as a whole, and then also that sort of quantum in between. And then what we looked at is determinants of sprawl, and really measured the correlation between that index and factors that we were looking at in terms of causes of urban sprawl. So if you can hit the next slide. And these are the determinants of the sprawl that we saw a positive correlation, that really looked at, you can kind of bucket these in sort of 3 main kind of areas. One is the influence of sort of the urban economic theory, central business district, those metropolitan areas that had a strong central business district versus dispersed sort of employment. Those areas that are built around that were built around a transit system, or those cities that were really built around a more car dependent type of urban form. The uncertainty in terms of population growth, whether it was sort of a fast-paced growth versus a staggered growth, sort of boom and bust a bit that you see in some areas. And then also I think that the interesting one that fascinated me was the ability to drill a well, really what the presence of an aquifer essentially, and where water could be gained access to outside of municipal systems. Ruggedness of terrain, and that is really around sort of foothill types of physical forms, versus sort of mountainous areas where urban growth is much more compact because of the sort of physical constraints. Temperate climate, I think that speaks for itself. Areas that are not too hot, areas that are not too cold. The areas that have sort of that perfect weather in the middle really have positive correlations with determinants of sprawl. And then lastly, the last two ones I think are I'm going to talk about in sort of the next study, and it's really around the percentage of land at the urban fringe that is subject to municipal planning regulations. So if there is, there are many areas in the United States in particular that municipalities are unincorporated municipalities, and so less regulation. So that is where we saw a higher correlation of sort of the sprawl index. And then lastly, areas where public services were not really were basically subsidized and not really put to the local or felt by the local taxpayers in their full. Those are areas where the sprawl index was positively correlated and higher. So you can hit them. So you can think about these kind of three buckets of urban economic theory, physical geography, environment, and governance issues. I would suggest those last two are part of. These are really sort of the kind of main buckets of drivers of sprawl that we found in the study. So you can hit the next slide. So moving on to some work that I did with Zach Taylor, this is really looking at the influence of urban development policy regime and on urban expansion. And what do we mean by that? We mean that, what are the institutions that basically organize metropolitan governance and intergovernmental relations, be it with the individual municipalities with themselves or higher tiers of government like states, provinces, and actually the federal government as well. The influence of individual sort of economic actors, and this is really the developer and builder industry. Influences of the policy paradigm. So what is the policy, what are urban planners, what is the urban planning policy paradigm or framework of the day, smart growth being one of them in the 1990s or through the early 2000s. And then that's really followed by policy objectives and instruments that governments can use and want to use to pursue those sort of policy objectives. So if you hit the next slide. I apologize for this, but if you go into the publication, you can see this much better. So we looked at Calgary, Edmonton, Vancouver, and Toronto, and that blue area is sort of a time frame by which the urban expansion efficiency regime. So that is really about the goals are really to produce as much housing as possible to accommodate growth, low cost housing, and low infrastructure costs as well, in a contiguous sort of master plan kind of pattern of suburban expansion. The other sort of policy regime is this intensification oriented kind of sustainability regime, where the goals are to really increase intensification. That is, utilizing the existing urban environment and building up and building more dense accommodations, and then also preserving, simultaneously while preserving agricultural land, reducing automobile use, and fully exploiting the sort of the infrastructure systems, water and wastewater, mainly in the urban environment. So as you can see, Calgary, sort of the Western cities, Calgary and Edmonton had this sort of urban expansion regime all the way up into sort of the mid 2010s. And Edmonton, so our timeline really stops around 2014. But Edmonton is actually sort of pursuing that intensification sustainability regime as we speak. Vancouver had introduced this sort of intensification and sustainability regime earlier on than most of the Canadian cities. And that was really in the sort of mid 1970s to the early 1980s. And that's partly because it had a governance structure by which that governance structure really had control of water and wastewater. And then finally, in the Toronto region, we really saw this kind of intensification, urban sustainability regime take place in the sort of mid 2000s, where smart growth was really sort of taking hold, and the provincial government introduced a smart growth sort of style plan into the area. So if you can hit the next slide. And this is sort of the outcome, right? So the 1991 is the dark urban area, 10 years of growth to 2001 is that blue area, another 10 years of growth is in that white area to 2011. And what we see is in that first decade between 1991 to 2001, it really reflects the type of policy regime that was happening. So in Calgary, I mean, it grew by almost 50% in terms of its footprint. Edmonton, the same sort of thing. These were all sort of periods of growth, of high growth periods. And then in the second decade, that 2001 to 2011, all, you know, as these these regions were moving into sort of a more sort of sustainability, smart growth kind of regime, you see the footprint drop. And in many cases, they actually sustained the population growth that was happening in these areas. And in the case of Toronto, it actually accelerated. So adding more people, but using less land, essentially, was happening in Toronto and Vancouver and even in Calgary. If you can hit the next slide. I would say the next influence on urban expansion is really what's happening in employment changes. So this particular study, if you can see the map, what that spikes out is essentially tradable jobs. So jobs that where income is coming in, services and goods are going out in exchange for money coming in from outside of the region. And what we see here is that, you know, the downtown Toronto, this is Toronto that you're looking at here, downtown Toronto has accelerated in terms of the job growth that's been happening there. While our suburban areas, you know, and these kind of these nodes that are happening outside of the downtown city, growth in those areas, job growth in those areas were actually declining. And what we're also finding is that, as you look at the types of jobs that are growing, they are really more white collar jobs in this particular area, even though it has a heavy manufacturing presence to it, it has a heavy logistics presence to it. It is the white collar office style jobs that are growing, and that was pre-pandemic putting pressure on the downtown because a lot of the growth was in jobs were happening in the downtown. If you can hit the next slide. And then that leads me to sort of this last piece of work that we've been doing at the Toronto Region Board of Trade. And that is looking at categorizing the jobs that are within our region to these sort of 5 types of business districts. As we, in the metropolitan center, which we know of as sort of essential business district, the goods production and distribution. So this is where all the warehousing happens, the manufacturing happens, where the e-commerce is happening on a daily basis. Services and mixed use. This is sort of the areas in our suburban areas that are, sort of the typical office parks, maybe some light industry, maybe some shopping that's adjacent to it. Regional centers. So these are sort of the mini downtowns in our urban growth centers in the suburban areas. And then the last district is really around these knowledge creation. So these are our universities, our colleges, our large teaching hospitals, all sort of areas that have sort of specializations in terms of the economic activities that happen there, specializations in terms of the labor force moving in and out of them. So really understanding the nuances that are happening within these districts and understanding the needs of these districts as they grow is really important. And what I want to really highlight here that I think is not getting enough attention in terms of urban expansion is the influence of the rise of e-commerce on urban expansion. If you can see here, those sort of light blue areas, all of these 5 districts, about 75% of the Toronto region's jobs are located in one of these 5 districts. But 65% of the land area of these districts is taken up by the goods production distribution. So that's, as I said, manufacturing, warehouses, logistics, with only 36% of the jobs. So I personally, my opinion is that municipalities, regional planners are not paying enough attention to the land consumption that this particular economic activity requires, and is continuing to grow. I mean, as we saw through the pandemic, and as we will continue to see post-pandemic. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you again for the invitation, and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Marcy, for this quite original presentations. There are a lot of drivers here that I did not begin to consider, including what you just said, the effect of these goods distribution centers and warehousing on urban expansion. We'll get back to it during the discussion. I would now like to introduce Professor Robert Bruegmann will be our second panelist. Bob, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Solly. Let me see about getting my presentation up. Are we seeing it?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, very good. I'm very much appreciate the invitation to be here at this webinar. Because I'm an architectural historian, I thought I'd share a few thoughts on history, and particularly the history of this enterprise of measuring and observing the city over the last couple decades. This book that you're looking at appeared in 2005. I was really working on it intensively from about 1995 to 2005. And I think that was a very critical moment in the discussion about cities, how we view them, how we measure them. So let me start here by saying that when I was beginning this work in the 90s, at the time, most urban scholars wanted to see cities as a kind of physical determinism. They would describe cities as being symptoms of basic economic systems, the pre-industrial city, the post-industrial city, or even more frequently, they would talk about them as a result of transportation systems. So you would have the walking city, then the transit city, and then finally the automobile city. So as people would view, urban scholars would view Paris, they would see it as a walking city overlaid by a transportation city, a transit city, and then finally imposition into that of the automobile. Most of the studies that were around at the time were single cities, and mostly they were the cultural capitals of the affluent Western world. They tended to focus on the monumental core, not surprisingly, because this is where most scholars lived and worked and where the government agencies were. There were actually astonishingly few studies of the suburban periphery and the expansion out of the core. I'm just showing you here one of the most important early examples for the Paris region, but these were very, very few and far between. Now, this term sprawl had been around. Here's a publication from the 1970s. Already by the 1970s, planners had decided that sprawl was terrible, and so most studies were about how to stop it. But this really didn't become a popular phrase or a popular subject until the 1990s, when suddenly it really took off. Now, for most people, most of the people that wrote on the topic in this period between 95 and 2005, as I say, sprawl was really bad. They thought it was recent, had largely happened since World War II, was mostly American, or at least North American, and primarily fueled by the automobile. Los Angeles was famously the poster child for sprawl. This became so accepted that you could even see this kind of critique in airlines magazines, which of course are the places where people are most interested in not offending anybody. But even there, you could hear that these suburban developments, like the picture that you see on the airline magazine here, were terrible and were ruining the environment. Now, this attack was not new by any means. It had been around, and particularly in Britain from the beginning of the century. These were largely urban experts, planners, scholars, academics, social scientists. And for the most part, they were very much opposed to suburban expansion. So this is just a typical example. There's this costly new bungalow, no vulgarity spared, according to Clough Williams Ellis. I have to say that one of the interesting things about that image that we just looked at was the aesthetic bias. which has changed. More recently, the arguments are more likely to be economic, social, environmental, but the aesthetic, the class-based aesthetic, is still very much in play. So the idea then was, how would you stop the sprawl? And the great pioneer in this was London. The London planning regime of 1947, instituted by the Labour Party when they came to power after World War II, involved very tight regulations around urban development in all of Britain. And the major introduction of that they made was the Green Belt, which was put around the major cities. And here you see the Green Belt of London. If London grew faster than expected, it would have to jump the Green Belt and be accommodated in small new towns on the periphery. These planning ideas that we had to stop sprawl, constrain the city, became very much part of the planning regime in many American cities, not all, certainly. And this logic, and it was adopted in Western Europe as well, was then exported all over the world to places that were very different, to Africa, to Asia, where American planners, European planners would go to these places and say, don't do what we did, don't make the same mistakes we made, stop sprawl right now. Now, as an architectural and urban historian, I wanted to look at this, and I used what was at my disposal, which was primarily, my primary tool was a close observation of what was actually out on the ground rather than what should be on the ground. And so I spent a lot of time on airplanes and the window seat looking out, and in the car looking out the windshield. And what I saw absolutely did not match what I was reading in the urban literature. So for example, I looked at Los Angeles, almost always described as low density sprawl. But I could see immediately, without even doing much research, that this was plainly wrong. This is a very typical part of central Los Angeles. And even though there are no high rises right here and no densities like you would see in the Upper East Side or Upper West Side of Manhattan, still, this is very densely built over. The lot sizes were always smaller in Los Angeles than most of the rest of the country. And there were and are a lot of people living in each of these houses. So I think that we could say that just empirically looking at it, that this was actually high density, and this high density continued pretty much to the edge where it stopped because the water was no longer available beyond the municipal water supply. So I think we could say that Los Angeles was one of the least sprawling cities in North America. On the other side of the coin, I drove around Paris and its suburbs. And as I said, I was amazed at how little was written about suburban Paris, because this is where 3/4, 4/5 of the population lived already by that time. Paris center was declining in population, had been declining since the 19th century. And the majority of Parisians lived in places like this, many of them in single-family houses with automobiles. I also saw that this trend was not new either. So in the middle of the 19th century, during the urban renewal of Baron Haussmann and Napoleon III, we had a tremendous amount of demolition in places like this. I don't think anyone was unhappy to see, most people were not unhappy to see this go. And in place, we had buildings like this that accommodated a much higher people in much higher socioeconomic status. At the same time, we had a lot of urban expansion on the periphery out in the suburbs. So I think that gentrification at the core and the proliferation of the suburbs have always been flip sides of the same coin. A second thing that I did was I tried to look fairly widely at urban expansion. And at the time, this was rather new. Interestingly enough, the best evidence was from the classical world, because so many people had been studying ancient Athens and Rome. And I realized that the suburbanization had been very important there too, both in Greece and in the Roman Empire. We're looking here at Herculaneum, which was really a seaside resort, but at suburban densities by Roman imperial standards. And by the way, the densities at the center of these cities were enormous and continued to be enormous all the way up until the Industrial Revolution, when they started to decline precipitously, except in the poorer cities of the world, where they still remain at extremely high densities. And I also went and took a look, a very cursory look, at a lot of places around the world, in Asia, South America, Africa, and was very surprised to see that, although there was not much reporting on it, that when people became affluent in these places, they often built things that looked very much like American suburbs. But the chief problem then was how to put some data behind all of this, so it wasn't just anecdotal. And the great breakthrough here occurred when I saw a study by a geographer named Colin Clark, who created this graph showing the decentralization of London from the 19th century up to the time he was writing, right after World War II. And as you can see, the density gradient here shows the number of people per square mile on the vertical axis, and then the distance from the center on the horizontal axis. And what it's showing you is that over the years, people would move from the center out toward the periphery, the constantly expanding periphery. And this was pretty much continuous for the last couple of centuries. And this was an eye-opener for me. And what it did was, when I put it together with some of the maps that were prepared around the same time, this one for the Greater London Plan of 1944, I could trace on the ground very easily the development of London from these 19th century row houses, middle class row houses, to the equivalent between the wars, which was the semi-detached house. And I could trace very easily on the ground and from the air how the cities developed, and could correlate this with both the charts and the maps. Now, interestingly, this happened at a particular moment in time. That is, we're talking the early 20th century, the 21st century, where a number of people were thinking about exactly the same issues. So, for example, the Wendell Cox in the United States started doing an important study where he was trying to create a database of cities around the world and their density. And although this was rough and ready, this was really a pioneering effort. And what it showed most dramatically, which I don't think anyone had appreciated before, was that with almost no exception, poorer cities in the world remained at very high densities. And with one single exception, Hong Kong, the more affluent cities in the world were lower densities and declining. So, for example, Wendell Cox showed the Los Angeles, and he showed that, interestingly, Los Angeles was one of the cities of the American South and West that was actually increasing slightly in density when large old cities like Chicago were declining. And what this meant was that with the radical decentralization of Paris, London, New York, and the slight increase in density in a place like Los Angeles, densities were converging in a tight band. I don't think anyone has ever explained why this is happening. The suburbs have become denser. The central cities have become much less dense. Why is this happening? And I guess my tentative hypothesis is that it's the kind of urban environment in which you can have all of the urban amenities, but you can still have an automobile. But this is just a hypothesis. At the same time, Solly Angel was starting his work, which was on the same lines, that same idea of trying to understand the dynamics of cities. Unfortunately, this publication, which was really an eye-opener for almost everybody that saw it, came out in 2005, just as my book was coming out. And I should say that Marcy Burchfield's work, almost exactly the same time, with exactly the same goals, this has been greatly expanded by Solly. in subsequent publications, which have ratified his conclusions, which show this just enormous expansion of urban areas throughout the world. So my book came out in 2005. By this time, I already had evidence, even if I wasn't really fully aware of the work that Solly and others were doing, that this decline in urban densities had been all but universal, particularly in the affluent world, at least since the beginning of the 20th century. And what was interesting to me is that this seemed to happen no matter what the economic or political system or the mode of transportation. It would go from streetcars to cars, but this urban expansion was pretty well continuous. What it did seem to correlate with was affluence, increasing affluence. As people had more money, they wanted to have the same things that rich people, powerful people had always had: more control of their environment, more mobility, and not incidentally, more choice, more ability to make decisions based on their own needs and wants. So I think that my explanation for the causes of this rapid urban expansion couldn't really be explained by any of those factors, economics or transportation system. It really had to be the actions of millions of individuals acting simultaneously, trying to improve their lot in life based within the restraints of a particular time and place. One of the things that also became quite clear were these planning regimes that attempted to really radically channel growth in one place or another, either to densify it or to let it grow outward. The London Greenbelt was ostensibly about intensifying, but actually it turned out in the end to be distributing the population out even further, because growth was faster than expected and affluence was much greater than expected. So a lot of these planning schemes, and I think this is a cautionary tale for planners, either had a lot of unintended consequences, or they actually backfired and produced results that were the opposite of what was intended. So there was nothing that was really new about any of these things that I was saying. They were all observable when you went out to the landscape, but when I put them in a book, this aroused a real hornet's nest when a lot of people, particularly urban experts, read the book and were just horrified by my conclusions. They were especially incensed by my observation that many people, both in the affluent world and elsewhere, were looking for the same things, the same kind of urban goods that the wealthy people had always had: more control of their surroundings, better mobility, and more of a choice in how they lived. And although these goals could be achieved in any number of ways, for example, you could have an apartment in Manhattan, but then you would have a little country house in the Hamptons. That would give you all kinds of space that you wouldn't have with just the apartment. For many people, and many middle-class people the world over, the easiest way to get these things was the single-family house and the automobile. So I think that these conclusions that I came to dramatically undermined many of the planners' assumptions about what cities were or what they should be. At the time, we were very much in the mode of the smart growth, which wanted to believe that we needed to think small, conserve, get out of our cars, get back to public transportation, do more recycling, eat less meat. And this is probably all very good prescriptions, but when they took this to the developing world, to the global South, I think it wasn't just inappropriate, but it could be unfair, even deadly. What people in these parts of the world need is more energy, not less, more meat, more refrigerators, more air conditioning. And somehow, for an equitable world, we need to figure out how to make that happen. I think one of the most important lessons from this webinar series is how difficult it is even defining a city, let alone measuring it, and by extension, then trying to manage it. I think this suggests that we need a measure of modesty in order to understand as we try to define the dynamics of urbanization and how much we really need to learn before we can confidently prescribe solutions to many of the pressing problems. Now, one last thought. I thought I'd end with this example of this kind of uncertainty. Because of the pandemic, I've been in Palm Springs for most of the last 2 years. Palm Springs is part of what is really a city of 500,000 people in the desert in the Coachella Valley east of Los Angeles. But in many ways, this city defies the kind of measurement analysis that we've heard about for other places. The part of this valley where I'm living is a resort area with lots of houses occupied by retirees or used only occasionally or rented out. It's like an increasing number of places around the world like it. For example, vast stretches of the European, Atlantic, and Mediterranean coasts. These are places where density figures or even population figures don't tell us much. Do we measure Palm Springs in summer when the number of people in the city is 40,000, or in winter when it is over 200,000? How do you count when the line between part-time and full-time residents is mostly an artifact of the census, but in reality it's blurry? It's also hard to imagine Palm Springs in one of the traditional ways we define a city as a labor market. Surprisingly few people actually go to work here. If they do work, they often do it at home, but for companies in Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, or London. Even more than Los Angeles or Phoenix, the distinction in this area between what is urban and what is suburban is blurred. Although it has many features that most people would call urban, fine dining restaurants, lots of theater, a very active social artistic community, the built environment looks extremely suburban. I think that this uncertainty about city has only increased with COVID as more people are working from home, more people arrived here in the Coachella Valley from larger cities, in many cases with no intention to go back. So my guess is that places like Palm Springs might well be giving us some taste of what urban areas might look like as society gets wealthier and more people have the kinds of control over their environment, mobility, and choice that the wealthiest and most powerful members of society have long enjoyed. And that's what I have to offer.
Thank you, Bob, for the wonderful and challenging presentation. I must say that this is what I expected from you. It comes as no surprise. I will now introduce our third and final panelist, my colleague, Alain Bertaud. Alain, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, I would like to follow really directly on Bob Bruegmann's presentation. I read his book about 10 years ago, and indeed I was surprised by its, let's say, its pragmatic attitude toward observing cities. And it corresponded exactly to my experience, although I had not expressed it by book that far, that in fact cities are the fruit of a spontaneous order. Planners try to modify this spontaneous order all the time, but it is part of a spontaneous order, and that's in a way what Robert Bruegmann showed us. You know, when he showed this convergence of density. So the first thing is that observing cities around the world, there is no optimum density, there is no optimum land use. It is only people who are in those cities are trying to cope with whatever constraint they have. It could be the constraint of topography, like say in Vancouver or in Mumbai, or it could be the constraint of a green belt, like in London, or it could be also, let's say, very large subsidies for gasoline, for instance, like you find in Cairo or Tehran. So it makes, of course, transport extremely cheap by car for those who can afford cars. So all these things contribute to what the people are dealing with, and it creates a spontaneous order. There is no optimum density. There is no optimum even layout. One thing, though, we can, let's say, if we observe those cities over many years, that's, by the way, one of the great virtue of the work of Solly Angel, is to have a given time series, you know, rather than looking at a city at a certain time, given time series. We see that there's still a convergence. Jobs which were in the 19th century very often concentrated in the center of the city, because many jobs were industrial and were relying on railway, by the way. Those jobs have now dispersed, and there are more and more dispersion of jobs through a metropolitan area. There are more and more trips which are from suburbs to suburbs rather than from suburbs to the center. Those trips then are done sometime, most of the time in rich country by individual cars, but in developing country where people cannot afford them, then they are done by informal sector microbuses, which are make their own itinerary and which are completely demand driven. So in a way, you have a spontaneous order which deal with specific constraints in specific cities. That's why you have densities like you find in Hong Kong of, an average density in the built-up area of around, depending on the way you count, 500 people per hectare. And you have cities like Houston, where the average density, the built-up density is something like around 8 to 10 people per hectare. So we have, practically more than one order of magnitude difference. Nobody can argue that Hong Kong is wrong and Houston is right, or Houston is right and Hong Kong is wrong. They just cope with their own environment, their own economy. What is the job of the planner then, if the planner doesn't control density? The job of the planner is to make sure that this, as a city expands, the different parts of the city are connected together. One thing we have learned from urban economics is that the largest the labor market, the largest effective labor market, the more productive is a city, the more invention more innovative is a city. So it means that you could have a very large city like, say, Mexico City with 20 million people, but you cannot assume that if you live in the south of Mexico City and you find a fantastic job in the north, you can take this job because it will take you 2 or 3 hours to get there. So the job of the planner is to connect this different part of the city. It is also, of course, to remove the distortion, either, let's say, the subsidies to gasoline, for instance, but also other distortion, like using abusively eminent domain, for instance, as it is done in China very often, to acquire land in area where, so not reflecting really the real value of the land. That's a way of doing it. So removing those constraints, but basically is to connect the city together. And then, so the other element is to ensure affordability. Many cities which are very productive, like say Boston or San Francisco or New York, are extremely productive, but young people, young households who have to come to those cities, just they can't find a job there. They cannot find a house there, and that, I think, is very detrimental. There is actually interesting studies by Yeti and Moretti, which shows that probably, I think they evaluate the cost to GDP of this lack of affordability of successful city at something like 3 or 4% of GDP. This is huge. That means that somebody who is very skilled could contribute to the economy of New York or San Francisco is obliged to stay in a smaller city where the jobs are not as challenging and where their skills are not used to their full possibility. So this is one element. Now, I would like to continue this with answering a bit some of the questions that Soli asked at the beginning of this session. You know, he had a list of things. What make people consume land? Why the city expand? And he has a list. And when I read this list, you know, for instance, city income per capita, availability of buildable land, availability of transport or water infrastructure, my reaction is all of the above. In some city, one will be more important. For instance, availability of water will be more important than in another city. But all of these are important. One thing sometimes bothers me, and more recently, by the way, through a report by the World Bank, where they assume that if a city population double, if the expansion of the city is more than double, then it's not efficient. I challenge that, and as again, Bob Bruegmann will have also challenged it. Basically, a city, when a city expands, that means there are more jobs. You know, a city expands because there are jobs, with the exception again of this retirement community that Bob talk about. But in general, it's a labor market will drive the population of a city. So what really drives the consumption of land is building. You know, a city is not about land, it's about building, floor space. If you are more affluent, you are going to consume more floor space. You know, in China, for instance, the consumption of floor space, residential floor space per capita in the 1980 was in Shanghai 4 square meters per capita. It is now something around 30 square meters per capita. So obviously, if you consume more floor space, you need more land. You could substitute capital for land and build high, but in general, most of the city is still expanding in the suburbs, and there is no reason in a suburban area to build skyscraper. You know, you build skyscraper in the center of the city where land is extremely expensive, but not there. So not only the city therefore have to expand more because people consume more land, not only for residential, but they consume also more land for schools. They consume, you know, even a grocery store. If you go in a slum in Mumbai, you'll see grocery stores are sometimes no more than 6 or 9 square meters, and they serve a large population with 9 square meters. If you go in a more affluent neighborhood, you will have a supermarket of several hundred square meters just to cater practically to the same need. So all these things take space, and there is no reason to arbitrarily say the optimum density or a city should expand just at the same pace as its population. It is possible that some city, by the way, could densify. That was the case of Bogota for, by the way, political and security reasons. They densify. It could happen, but I don't think we have to understand why a city expand or shrink, by the way, without necessarily porting a judgment. The job of the planner is to provide services to wherever the people decide to settle, and their consumption of land and floor space is entirely based on the individual. With that, I thank you very much for this interesting presentation, especially the people who preceded me. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Marcy and Bob and Alain, for sharing your knowledge and your insights with us on this topic. For the next 15 or 20 minutes, I'd like to ask you, if possible, to comment on what the other panelists said. I think that Marcy gave us a kind of a relatively comprehensive list of the factors and the forces that influence urban expansion. I noticed also that you emphasized, Marcy, the availability of groundwater and the possibility to drill wells. This is what's driving urban expansion in Bangkok, for example, right? There's a very low, there's a groundwater people can, and there is no piped water system in Bangkok. Neither is there a sewer system. But the result of all this well drilling is subsidence. And the city is sinking about below sea level with all the pumping, because once you pump water out of layers of clay, the clay shrinks and the city subsides. Also, when we have kind of unmitigated urban expansion, there are the people who are worried about global warming say, well, the continuous use of the car, larger infrastructure lines, suburban homes, it is true that this is what people want, but they're somehow not paying the full cost in terms of their effect on energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. So there has to be some resolution of these different considerations. And the planners, I don't want to be the one defending them, but the planners that are asking for densification or for the control and containment of urban expansion feel like they're representing the public interest in terms of saving our planet from warming. I wanted to ask the three panelists, and what I liked about the presentations is also the changing explanations for urban expansion. You know, it's not the same. Cities expanded for different reasons in the 18th century than they do now. And we have new kinds of cities, like Bob was mentioned, which are cities of consumption rather than cities of production. So where most of the people there are just consuming, and there's very little direct production. At the same time, there's a lot of warehousing to send all the packages. And now we are also confronted with more web exchanges and more pressures for less commuting and more staying at home. So what I would like to ask you is to reflect on what the other panelists have said and how it affects your thinking. And I'll start with Marcy, please.
Sure. Thanks, Ali. Funny story, Bob, is I was in an audience when when you first presented your book to a bunch of philanthropists, actually, who all were funding organizations who were trying to stop sprawl. And I just remember how livid some of them seemed to be during the presentation. So I just wanted to share that with you. But I think, you know, what struck me about Bob's presentation, and it kind of comes back to what this sort of the policy regime of you know, and flavor of the time, is that, you know, with smart growth, there seemed to be kind of a value judgment placed upon the type of development that was happening where. And I absolutely 100% agree that, you know, that part of what is happening is the creation of wealth, you know, for those who are in middle class and lower, you know, the mobility of people. That was part of the story. And so this you know, I as a person who worked for a non-for-profit, tried to avoid the use of the word sprawl for a very long time because it was such a value-driven kind of term. But I do think, and I think I said off the top, Sally, that I'm not a planner, but I work with a lot of planners, and absolutely, there's a public interest that they're trying to balance with some of the work. I think there's also constraints, you know, as cities grow. in particular, this notion that Alain said that their job is to connect people. Sometimes their job ends at a border, and is taken up by another planner at on the other side of that border. And the governance system that I talked about is not in place and is not keeping up with the expansion of our city regions. And so it is very difficult to connect to folks, in most cases, it's really connecting folks to jobs. As jobs expand and are distributed across the region. And I want to also come back to the point that, this in order to be more productive, more innovative, that what's happening is actually in those cities that are producing, whether it's jobs or whether it's goods or services, that it's really what it comes down to is they're locating in areas where they can be innovative and productive. So it's actually coming back to in the case of many of the metro centers in Canada, it's coming back to the urban center. And the best, because part of that is because the best way to capture the specialization of services they need or the specialization of skill sets they need is to capture that kind of regional labor force, because that center still has the best connectivity, even though we are seeing, the rise in trips, from suburb to suburb. If you look at where the innovation is happening in some of the jobs, it is typically in a more concentrated, dense center that's connected to a broader labor force. So that's part of I'll stop with there. And I think we all need to speak about the affordability factor, because I think that is our biggest challenge in terms of growing an equitable city region, is that, cities still are attractors of people, because there's wealth generation that is part of that comes along with it, and they're becoming less and less affordable for people, particularly younger generations.
I totally agree with you on that comment, Marcy, and I think that what I was talking about before with you, that the idea of making room is we need to make room where people want the room. And what we're going to do, if we're going to bring the more creative people into urban centers, we're going to gentrify places that are going to push out lower income people. And these lower income people need the access that Alain was talking about. So the more we can expand, but we need to expand in a way that's connected and that kind of bridges over the kind of municipalities into metropolitan regions that are well managed and well connected, in order to overcome this affordability problem, which I believe is much more a supply side problem than a demand side problem. Let me turn to Bob. Bob, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, I certainly agree with most of what Marcy says, and just a further word about that affordability issue. The star cities, San Francisco or Vancouver, Manhattan, they are the places where there has been most sort of control over the planning regime. And those are the places significantly that have the highest problem of affordability. The affordability is most difficult. On contrast, there's Houston, which is has very little planning of the traditional kind. And I don't myself believe that either one or the other is right or wrong. I think the issue here is that for every action that a public agency takes to plan, there's benefits and there's costs. And I think we just have to realize those. But what I'd like to do is step away from the center of cities for a moment to the periphery, and particularly, Sally, to those places that you were talking about that rely on wells. There has been an argument that these places, and I like to call these peri-urban or exurban, because they're beyond the reach of the municipal water and sewer typically. These places have been castigated by a lot of people because they're wasteful. There's more transportation, bigger infrastructure necessary. But I think a different way to look at it is that infrastructure, which used to be big, massive infrastructure, one single generating plant, one single wastewater treatment plant for huge numbers of people, I don't think we need this anymore. I think that in an ideal circumstance, you can imagine a household out in the periphery, miles from anything, working at home, collecting all the water they need on the roof, being a completely using solar and geothermal to generate all the electricity that's needed in the house. You can imagine that this might be a much more ecological, environmentally friendly place to live than an apartment in Manhattan. Again, I don't believe there is a value judgment to be made here. I just think that we need to evaluate all of the choices and see what their ramifications are.
Thank you, Bob. Alain.
Yes, I think that, we cannot remove the affordability issue from the issue of land consumption in general and whether it should be limited or not limited. To answer, this thing, like Marcy and Bob and Solly mentioned, is that planners in general try to encourage higher densities. At the same time, the only tool they have to control land use is to reduce densities. They have a maximum floor ratio, minimum plot size, minimum street, widths and things like that. So in a sense, all their tools are in fact to push people to consume more land than they would normally. That's why we have floor ratio or minimum lot size. At the same time, then they try to limit the expansion of city at the same time. So I think that here we have a bit of a conundrum, and I think planners should realize that increasing floor ratio in itself do not create higher building or higher density unless there is a high demand in this area. And so a city driven by demand, it will be probably the most efficient city. Again, if you remove the distortion and if people pay for what they consume. And again, the question of transport. The idea, for instance, this thing going around now, the 15-minute city, which was launched by the mayor of Paris. Now, it's wonderful to buy your croissant within 15 minutes. I would say even 5 minutes would be better than 15 minutes. To buy your croissant in the morning, that's fine. But the idea that you could find your job in a metropolitan area like Paris within 15 minutes walking is, of course, complete nonsense. Complete nonsense. This is not the way people live. Even people who are living in the center of Paris, in the city that Bob showed us as with the tourist visit, not the real city, but the core. 30% of those people are in fact working in the suburbs, at the moment, although there are plenty of jobs in the city. So people, the city is a job market, and people are selecting the job which interests them, which have some advantages, which have nice colleagues or nice environment, I don't know, but that's what they do. And we have to understand all this job market work, and we have to support this job market, not to contradict and saying everybody should live and work within 15 minutes walk from his home.
And I'll just add on top of that, Alain, and what if you have a two-person working household too?
Yes,
So
exactly.
It's not just one person working within 15 minutes.
Well, you change your partner, I suppose, if you change job or something at the same time.
I want to ask the panel, and there are several questions from the audience relating to it, how this discussion, whether it's a discussion of sprawl or the points that have to do with the causes of sprawl, how this travels to developing countries. And the reason I'm saying that is because urbanization is fast becoming a developing country phenomenon. In most of the urbanization, as in move to the cities in the more developed countries, is over. And between now and 2050, for every person added to the urban population in the more developed countries, 18 persons will be added to cities in the less developed countries. Now, in terms of drivers of urban expansion, I know, for example, that in Kinshasa, the capital of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, all the development is in 1 of 2-story houses. And the reason is that there's no finance for building apartment houses. And as long as there's no finance, this is going to continue. So the absence of finance becomes a major constraint on densification. A recent World Bank paper seems to ignore that and saying, well, if there's development, there's going to be finance and we can have higher density development. So I wanted to know whether you can see connections or implications from your observations to developing country cities.
Well, Sally, one thing I would say about this is that I think that your work has been just exemplary, that you can't override the kind of development that's happening. And we know that 1/3 of the world is living in conditions where they're building their own houses because they can't afford to have the formal market build them. Now, under those circumstances, it's folly to think that you could build giant electrical plants or huge sewer systems at the outset. What you have to do is exactly what you've advocated, which is try to leave the room for those settlements to grow and eventually to retrofit them. And we've had this experience already in the affluent world, where there was a lot of this self-build in the 1920s, in Britain, for example, which has been regularized and now has all the services. So I think that the modest approach here to try to think ahead and think what's going to be possible in the future as people do what they can do to better their own lot is the only real path forward.
Thank you, Bob. Marcy?
I've worked less in the developing world than mostly in North American cities, but I would say, I think to build on Bob's point, it's really around the exporting the technology that makes these things happen, quickly and more efficiently, and that is part of the retrofit story as well. So. I agree that we often ignore where the real growth is happening in the world, particularly if we're going to link it to the broader impacts of climate change and and wealth, as I said, wealth generation, and the equity of folks. I think that we need to think about these issues, these problems to solve as we try to retrofit some of our own cities, but also as to where these technologies and these innovations can be scaled in areas where the developing world.
Thank you, Marcy. Alain?
Well, I think one example, successful example of this attitude, the right attitude of government will be in Indonesia, where the key program, the Kampung Improvement Program, basically in area which are identified as kampung, which is a special zoning of the Indonesian cities, people are able to build whatever they want. It's considered that it's a village management who decide what the standards are. So in a way, you have large settlements which are considered a bit like a private condominium, where the standards are set up by the people themselves, whatever they can afford. And the contribution to the city is to provide infrastructure support to those areas. For instance, they calculate how much water people need, and they will bring the water to the settlement, and then it's within the settlement they can decide what standard, how do they distribute this water. And so that way you have affordable housing which is created. And what is important, especially in many tropical countries, is not so much the house, it's infrastructure. If houses can have clean water and dirty water gets evacuated, if garbage gets removed, And if you have decent schools and dispensaries, this is what they need. And the government, if they need to subsidize something, they should subsidize this aspect and not the building of houses that will be designed by bureaucrats and will be usually distributed through a lottery and usually sorts of big corruption.
Thank you, Alain. In the few minutes left for me, let me kind of summarize and conclude the seminar. I think that what emerges from the discussion today is that on one hand, we have people's preferences as elucidated very clearly by Bob, what people want, what kind of life they have, or what here in America is referred to as the American dream, you know, a nice house with good access to schools and services, with constraints on development brought about by either limitations of the public sector to provide all the services, or restrictions with the idea that some of these preferences or some of these market forces create externalities like global warming or excessive depletion of the countryside that have to be properly accounted for. And I think that that tension remains and will remain. In general, when I summarize to myself the drivers of urban expansion as they have been discussed today, the first thing we see is population growth. The more population comes into the city, the more it expands. In fact, when we look at a global sample of cities, we see that when the population of a city doubles that of a smaller one, its area increases by approximately 70%. The other thing is income. Like Bob was saying, you know, people that have more money, they want the kind of things that rich people have, and they want more space and more floor space and more open space and bigger schools and bigger shopping centers and so on. That translates into area as well. So when the GDP per capita of a city doubles, the area of the city increases by roughly 55%. So, for example, we have two cities like Lagos and Paris. They have roughly the same population in 2015, but Paris has 10 times the GDP per capita as Lagos. And as a result, partially at least as a result, we see that Paris is 3.5 times larger in area than Lagos. So income. The things like the water supply that we discussed, things like natural barriers. Some cities can't expand. Like Alain noted, Mumbai, Hong Kong, Caracas, cities that are surrounded by mountains or water that can't expand, obviously don't expand as much. Security reasons in Bogota that prevent expansion because people are afraid to live in the suburbs because they may be kidnapped, may be reasons. The thing that strikes me as requiring more attention is how these causes or drivers of urban expansion also change over time. So with new transport technologies, different forces, with new communications technologies, different forces come into bear. With new pandemics, different forces come into bear. These things are dynamic. So it's not the same way, and I think both Bob and Marcy mentioned that the fashions in planning change over time. You know, so certain things are, you know, hot ideologies one decade, and the next decade people forget about them. And I think that one of the things that has emerged in the last decade to fight or as a response to attempt to contain cities and reduce supply is the affordability issue, which Marcy informs us correctly is now very much the central issue in these cities. So fashions change as well, and they also dictate policy towards urban expansion. And I think that with this comment, I have to thank Angela for hosting and Richard for hosting the seminar. Thank you, Juan Fernando, for coordinating it. And I want to thank Marcy Burchfield, Robert Bruegmann, and Alain Bertaud for the wonderful discussion in the panel. Thank you all. And I hope to see you in the next webinar, which will talk about urban containment, which will take place 4 weeks from now. Thank you and goodbye.